respect people's time. But especially in mindfulness classes, we like to start on time and end on time. And so welcome everyone for being here. We'll have people joining us, I'm sure, as the session progresses. I'm Ni-Cheng Lang. I am the founder of the Mindful Healthcare Collective and also a pulmonologist and a mindfulness teacher. And it's my great honor to welcome Dr. Steve Hickman, a dear friend, a colleague, one of my first mindfulness teachers, and current executive director for the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion and the founding executive director for the Center for Mindfulness at UCSD. He's here talking about his book, Self-Compassion for Dummies. And so I'm so excited to welcome you, Steve. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's awesome to be here and to think of the journey we've traveled parallel and together over the years. So it's nice to be here.
Yes, absolutely, our journey. And did you want to share with our listeners and attendees more about your book club story?
Yeah, sure. So in the very early days of teaching mindfulness at UC San Diego, which is where I met Ni-Cheng originally, I got training to teach mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, and was trying as hard as I could to fill classes and doing everything I could. And one of my colleagues who worked with me in the pain clinic at UCSD, who is a family medicine doctor, or internal medicine doctor, excuse me, invited me to what they called a book club. It seemed like it was a little more like a support group for physicians at UCSD, but they did do a book club type activities. And she asked me, would I come and sort of host a session on full catastrophe living, John Kabat-Zinn's kind of seminal book on MBSR. And I was happy to, because this was a great opportunity to get the work out. And so we scheduled it, and she told the whole team, all of the members, and said, hey, go get the book. We're going to talk about the book at the session. And there was about 12 people who showed up at the session, which I thought was great. And I sort of checked in with everyone to see, so what do they generally think about the book? And well, 2 or 3 of them had read a chapter, and a couple others had skimmed through it, and others just had bought it, and that was kind of it. And everyone had an excuse. Everyone's, this has been, mindfulness is of interest to me, but I used to do yoga in college, but I never really got back to it. And I meditated for a little while, and then I just sort of, drifted away, and really wish I could get back to it. And literally everyone in the room had some sort of excuse. And one particular doctor, I can still picture him, said, you know what? He said, we all sound like our patients, who are like saying, yeah, I started to exercise, and then I couldn't keep it up. I hurt my ankle, and I meant to take the yoga class, but I never quite got around to it. They just looked at each other, and they all kind of got a little sheepish looking, and they ultimately asked me to teach an MBSR course for them, which a good chunk of them actually participated in, and they became great referral sources, and some of them even actually read the book eventually. So that's, I guess we can hope for that from here. But sometimes we need a little opening and a little nudge in the right direction. So maybe that's what today could be.
I like that, a self-compassionate nudge towards self-compassion.
Yeah, if you're beating yourself up for not being self-compassionate, you're already in the hole right from the beginning. So
self-compassion all around. If you are here and you haven't read the book, we are just grateful you are here and have an interest in learning more about self-compassion. And hopefully today's session will inspire you to delve in further and read the book. So Steve, I know you from mostly the mindfulness world, and it's more recently that I've gotten to know you and see you in action at the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. So can you tell us a little bit about your personal journey from mindfulness moving into the self-compassion space?
Yeah, very briefly about how I came into mindfulness was I mentioned working a lot with chronic pain patients in our chronic pain clinic in anesthesia at UCSD. And discovered, without going into all the details, that the practice of mindfulness was incredibly supportive and helpful to people navigating life with chronic pain in particular. And that's what inspired me to go on to teach mindfulness and to become an MBSR teacher, and found it to be incredibly valuable for a lot of people. And actually came to find out about mindful self-compassion, which is a program that Chris Germer and Kristen Neff developed through another mutual colleague of ours, Michelle Becker, who went to a training with them. She came back from this training and said, "Oh my gosh, this program is amazing. Can I teach it at UCSD? And I think this is great. People need self-compassion." And I kept thinking, well, self-compassion is really part of mindfulness. And do we really need a separate course? I mean, really, if we're mindful, part of what comes out naturally is a natural wish to be happy and free from suffering, and a kind of warm attitude towards ourselves. So you really need another program. She finally talked me into it, and then later talked me into co-teaching it with her as well, which is a whole separate story. But the first two courses we taught at UCSD, we had a number of people who had mindfulness training, had taken the course from me, and were in that class, and something qualitatively different happened for them. And I don't say better or worse, it was just a different experience. And what I learned was that a lot of people learned to be able to be more present with their own experience, with their own thoughts and emotions and things like this. And mostly what they kind of took away from the class was that they could be with those feelings, that they could actually tolerate them. And at some level, that's probably, that's very valuable, that to be able to like have the shock absorbers on life, in other words, things come along and you can feel the bumps and the bruises and the reactivity, but you don't react to them so much. But in some cases, especially when people were particularly self-critical, perfectionistic, kind of driven by shame, being with all of that stuff was just daunting and overwhelming for some folks. And what they actually learned in the course was that they could not only be with them, but be with themselves, and to treat themselves kindly because they were going through it. The way you would treat a good friend when they struggle and suffer, and most folks listening, you'll probably know this experience, that the way you treat your friend when they have a hard time and the way you treat yourself when you have a similar kind of hard time, there's a mismatch there. Most people are much kinder, much easier for people to find a way to be kind to others and say, "Oh, I know this is tough, and I'm here for you, and you'll get them next time," or comfort and soothe somebody who's having a hard time. But when we fail or fall short or hurt, we often beat ourselves up. We say, "What's wrong with you? Why did you, you've never been good at this. You're no good at this." Various kinds of self-critical kind of stuff. So these folks, anyway, to go back to these folks, what they discovered was there was a way to be with themselves when they were having a hard time that actually allowed them to stay present and to respond to difficulty in a more helpful, resilient sort of way. So that just excited me. And the rest of the story is long and meandering, but except to say that there was so much happening there that I was inspired to want to help to share this work. And then because my particular passion is training teachers of mindfulness and self-compassion, was to help develop the teacher training program in the Mindful Self-Compassion program. So that's a short version.
Thanks, Steve. And I have a question about why you think it's so hard for many people to show ourselves the same kindness and compassion as we do our friends and loved ones. Like, why is that such a common issue for so many?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? But and I think a lot of that comes from, and this might sound weird. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I don't normally blame parents for everything. But quite often, the key people in our lives when we're younger inadvertently set the stage for a certain kind of self-criticism. And it's a complicated topic, but if you just think in terms of, for those of you who are parents who are listening, and you know those moments when you're overwhelmed, when you're stressed out, when you don't have the psychological, emotional resources to contend with things. You often do things that are expedient but not necessarily helpful, so that you yell at your kid to quiet down, for example, as a sort of semi-benign sort of example, or you want your kid to succeed, and so they come back with a 99 on the math test, and you say, well, what's the matter? Why didn't you get 100? You're not abusive, you're not being purposely hurtful. Well, what you actually want is for the child to succeed, to do the best that they can, to have everything that you want them to have. So when you kind of look at it that way, what happens is we get a message that's intended to try to help us, keep us safe, and to help us achieve. But it only kind of works in the short term. But we take it in. We're impressionable when we're young, right? And so if a caregiver says you need to get 100%, or implies that if you don't get 100%, you're never going to amount to anything, we take that in. And so we tend to feel, and we get short-term results from it, right? If you're driven, if you're perfectionistic, it might get you to the top of your high school class, or into medical school, or to get that particular job, maybe. But we actually know from some of the research that self-compassionate people can actually tend to try harder and achieve more, because they can tolerate the inevitable failures and things that happen like that. So it was kind of a convoluted answer to the question, but we kind of come by it honestly to a certain extent. Obviously, if we've had abusive, difficult early upbringing, we're going to incorporate some of that in our thinking as well. So sometimes people's internal critic, their self-critic, is the voice of someone who was extremely critical of them when they were younger, or abusive, and that sort of thing. So we kind of have it because it sort of works in the short term, but it doesn't work in the long term. It's sort of like, just one other thing, people will say, one of the cliches that you sometimes hear, well, you can't be compassionate for yourself unless you're compassionate, or you can't be compassionate to others unless you're compassionate to yourself. It sort of like sounds good, but it doesn't actually prove out in life, right? Because tons of people are incredibly compassionate to other people, and they're burning themselves out like crazy because they're giving, and not giving anything to themselves. And we know that if we're more compassionate to others than to ourselves. So it's not true that you can't be compassionate for others unless you're compassionate for yourself, but it's not sustainable, and that's the key, right? You can be the incredible, compassionate, Florence Nightingale to everybody else for a while, and if you're not also filling your own tank, you burn out, right? That's the whole thing about burnout. So if you want to have it sustainable, then you've got to be able to fill your own tank as well, and include yourself in the circle of compassion.
We have a question, thanks, Steve,
Oh yeah,
in the chat box that I think really ties in nicely with even deeper than our parents. Like,
yeah,
major
definitely.
religious traditions have concepts like original sin as part of origin stories, whereas others focus on our nature being whole and compassionate. Your thoughts about that and influencing how we show up as self-compassionate or not self-compassionate?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point, Gail, and it's probably worthy of 3 or 4 hours of conversation. But yeah, it isn't only our parents, and it's why I hesitated to even bring up parents to begin with, because it comes from so many things. There's also sort of cultural issues that come up around this, and issues of identity, and how people who share a particular identity have been mistreated and marginalized, and how that turns into feeling like you deserve things, or you don't deserve certain things because of your experience in life. And religion, for sure, and transgenerational kinds of issues like trauma. It just as a kind of I think it's interesting aside, I've taught mindful self-compassion a few times in Germany, and explored with some of my colleagues there the sort of intergenerational trauma of World War II and Nazis and Hitler, and how there's this undercurrent of shame that runs through, as far as I can tell, everyone I've encountered in an MSc course, that, you know, people who weren't even alive at the time but still carry with them the remnants of various bad behavior in the past that leaves them filled with shame and self-criticism and self-loathing and things like that. So there's so many different factors kind of working against us. And just one other piece around this, a lot of our struggle with this has to do with our evolution as human beings, or our need to be connected to others. You know, we're born helpless. We need to be connected to caregivers. We need food, clothing, and shelter. We need each other, you know, through our adulthood. We don't live in isolation. We're not an island to ourselves, right? And it's wired into our DNA to be connected to each other. You know, we know at some level, instinctive level, to cry as an infant to get what we need. You know, we have the means of staying connected, because if we're disconnected, that's our lifeline. And so we feel the disconnection. And really, this underlies a lot of the challenges around self-compassion, is the fear of being disconnected. So there's 3 components of self-compassion that Kristen Neff has identified. I just riffed right off of that question to something else here, but there's 3 components. One is mindfulness. So being able to be present and aware of the arising of struggle and suffering. Common humanity, which is the piece I'm speaking to here, is that we share our common humanity. We are all imperfect beings. We all want to be happy and free from suffering. We are not isolated, even though we fear that we will be isolated. We actually need each other, as I said. And then the third part is self-kindness. So mindfulness, common humanity, and self-kindness. So I always think that common humanity is the most powerful piece. First of all, when we have a hard time, we tend to think we are uniquely alone, flawed, bad, incompetent, whatever it may be, when in fact we share those kinds of fears with millions of other humans on the planet. At our very basic level, we fear being disconnected from the herd, from the pack, from the family. And what we really desire, the flip side of that, is to be loved. When we get love, we get everything we need. Food, clothing, shelter. And when the infant gets love, that's what they get. So we have this underlying need to be loved, and it can start with being able to actually love ourselves. And there's more to this, but I'll leave it for now. But there are factors, including, you know, genetic, evolutionary, spiritual, intergenerational factors that all kind of converge to have us struggle sometimes with being kind to ourselves.
And the mindfulness piece is such an important part of self-compassion. Can you speak a little bit more to that? And is it advisable to train for both mindfulness and in self-compassion, or is mindful self-compassion enough? What are your thoughts about that? Because there's 2 kind of distinct programs for mindfulness and mindful self-compassion, and others, of course.
Yeah, I think it does tend to vary for different people. I think having a strong mindfulness base, in other words, the capacity to observe and to stay present to your experience, and to be less reactive, and to have more equanimity in relation to experience, is a tremendously valuable foundational practice. And people who've taken MBSR are often the people who, or other mindfulness courses, tend to get the most out of the mindful self-compassion course, because they kind of develop that capacity or that skill. But frankly, there are a lot of people for whom the doorway in should be the other direction, especially if you're particularly self-critical, you have a lot of shame, a lot of perfectionism. It may be nearly intolerable to be mindful of what goes on inside the head and heart. And you might need those resources of self-compassion to comfort and soothe yourself because you have them, so that you can even sort of find your feet and ultimately, practice mindfulness. And really, they aren't two separate things. Really, compassion is the attitude of mindfulness. I go on rants on occasion, but I won't hear about different people teach mindfulness in different ways. I mean, good teachers are teaching mindfulness that is totally suffused with compassion. It's two sides of the same coin. And when you teach it with warmth and kindness, that's when you're teaching mindfulness. But there is a tendency for people to oversimplify mindfulness into something like bare attention, like practicing like a samurai is the phrase that Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield uses. It's sort of like cold and direct and rigid and hard. And that's not mindfulness. It is paying attention is a part of mindfulness, but not without warmth. So they kind of go together, and they work off each other. And we can't really practice self-compassion, because compassion has to do with meeting suffering with kindness, meeting our own suffering with kindness. So first you have to actually know that you're suffering. And strangely enough, in the moment, we often forget that we are suffering. We're just pushing past it. We're solving it. We're trying to ignore it. We're trying to push it away. So mindfulness allows us to see, oh, wow, this is a moment of suffering. And then from that point to say, well, yeah, and suffering is actually a part of every human being's experience. That's the common humanity. And given that, could I actually be kind to myself? That's how those three components work: mindfulness, common humanity, self-kindness. So you need the foundation. You need to be aware before you can really practice self-compassion.
Karen asked a question about speaking to self-compassion in healthcare specifically, some challenges and opportunities, and it kind of ties into what I was going to ask in that. So we had Kristen Neff on our podcast recently, and she left our listeners with the advice of just try self-compassion. And so for us who are here today, if not all of us on this session are healthcare professionals, and how can we just try self-compassion?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And often what happens is, when you start to talk about the opposite of self-compassion, like burnout, what people call compassion fatigue, that's really caregiver fatigue. And you ask somebody, well, what's the antidote? Like, what should I, what's the advice you give someone else when they seem burned out? And it's like, oh, you need to set better boundaries. You need to take a vacation. You need to go to the spa. You need to get a massage. And those are all very nice things, good things, to self-care and all that sort of thing. But that's not the challenge. I mean, it's a challenge finding the time, but the real challenge is, how could you breathe underwater? In other words, how can you practice self-compassion while you're being a healthcare professional of any sort? In other words, can you actually feed yourself, take care of yourself in the midst of your daily activities? And that doesn't mean like the example that Kristen sometimes uses. If you're a therapist and you're feeling, worked up by whatever your client is telling you, you can't say, well, you know what, you're kind of freaking me out a little bit. I'm going to need to step out of the room and meditate, and then I'll be back. Like, you can't pull that one off, right? You can't stop the surgery in the middle and say, I'm a little anxious right now, so I'm just going to take a break, these kinds of things. So two things. One is, when you can find the time outside of the stress of the daily activities or the job, whenever you can practice, it's like exercise. In other words, you go to the gym, not because you love hanging out at the gym, or at least most people don't necessarily like that, but you work out there so that you're stronger everywhere else. And so whatever practice you can put in your daily life around noticing moments of either opportunities to bring more present or to meet yourself with kindness, you create a greater likelihood that in the midst of your stressful day, the same thing can happen. But it doesn't have to be a you know, a timeout, so to speak. So self-compassion really can be as small, you know, we have this self-compassion break that comes from the mindful self-compassion program, which is really just deploying those three components. In a moment of difficulty and stress, could you just notice it's here? That's the mindfulness. Can you recognize, oh yeah, okay, so this is experience lots of people in this situation might have, they do have. And could I be kind to myself in this moment? It could take shorter than it took me to say that to do it. Like in a moment of difficulty, just acknowledging it, like, oh man, this sucks. You know, this hurts. And yeah, this is, you know, this is part of, you know, healthcare. This is part of my job, or this is, you know, right now it's like this. And then being able to say, what do I need? That's the fundamental question of self-compassion. What do I need? So it's okay to ask that question while you're tending to what someone else needs too. You know, it's complicated. That's what I mean by breathing underwater, but it is possible. You know, like maybe as someone is pouring out their heart to you about some sort of struggle, you can be listening, and you can also be in your own mind comforting yourself, either with kind words, an image, a hand on your heart, if that's appropriate in that setting. Maybe it's rubbing your hands together, any kind of sort of tactile comfort can sometimes be just a quick reminder, like, this is tough. Like, it's okay for it to be tough, because it is anyway. And then to be kind to yourself. So it can be these micro moments of self-compassion where you're not trying, not to throw too many things in here at once, but keep in mind that self-compassion is not about changing how you feel. It's not to make you calm down, to make you not sad, not anxious, you know, whatever. Those things may happen over time, but we give ourselves compassion not to feel better, but because we feel badly. So let that sink in a little bit, because it's really important. And everyone nods their head when I say it, but it's hard to grasp. We give ourselves compassion not to feel better, but because we feel bad. So think about the scenario when your child has the flu, and you're there and you're bringing them a cold compress, or, you know, something to drink, or you're saying sweet things, or you're giving them a hug. You don't think any of those is a means of treating influenza, right? You know that you are comforting them because they have it, because they're struggling and suffering. And this is the same thing with self-compassion. We're just meeting ourselves because it's hard. It's a novel concept, because usually we push through hard. You know, we ignore it. We're like, you know, like, I can't be bothered with feelings. I've got work to do, kind of a thing. But this is just acknowledging what's here already. And when we meet it, we're changing our relationship with our own struggle so that we can actually tend to ourselves and give ourselves what we need. And maybe what we need is just a breath, or maybe it's, if it's possible, to step out, or maybe it's something bigger, depending upon what you're facing. But asking yourself that fundamental question of what do I need is really this, that's enough. Like if in the next 24 hours, a time or two when you found yourself struggling, and you just simply pause long enough to ask yourself, what do I need right now? Or acknowledge that it's hard, that's the mindfulness, and to say, what do I need? You're starting to open the door to self-compassion. It sounds easy. It's not. It's simple, but it's not easy, as is mindfulness, but worth it.
And Miriam put in a thought-provoking comment here about some of our beating ourselves up as actually being protective. So if we beat ourselves up, we often find that others will show compassion towards us. And in some ways that validates us and provides us love. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny how that works. You know, the beatings will continue until morale improves, they like to say, you know, like we do get, there is something to it. Sometimes we're beating others to the punch. You know, if we criticize ourselves because, you know, whatever, we didn't do as well on an exam, or, you know, we, you know, failed at something, then we feel like if I can withstand my own beating, then anything anyone else throws at me will be less than that. So I can manage. And when you kind of say it like that, it sounds a little twisted, but it kind of works, right? And even to, I found kind of a kind of parallel thing with that, which is that if we criticize ourselves out loud in front of other people, it's actually a weird sort of way of getting people to say nice things about you, right? Because more or less, if you say, "Oh, I suck at this," people will say, "Oh, no, you don't. It's great. You're doing fine." This outfit is ugly. No, it's beautiful. Whatever it is. So there's that. So we do all these things, but I think the important thing is to see what's underneath those things. If you actually, we have an exercise in the Mindful Self-Compassion course called Motivating Ourselves with Compassion. And it's really about working with that inner critic, the one that beats us up, that's inside of us. And when you really look at it, kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about parenting and that sort of thing, is that if you happen to be someone who has an inner critic, there's 15 people on this call. I guess that at least 12 of us have inner critics, and maybe all of us. That voice that's always hammering at you one way or another. If you can look a little bit closer, if you can sidle up to it with a little compassion, be willing, you've heard it perhaps for all your life. You don't want to hear it. You try to resist it. You try to argue with it. It's still there. It maybe you mostly ignore it. But if you actually pause long enough to be with it and listen to it, you realize it's got a decent motive, because the motive is it's trying to take care of you. It's trying to keep you safe. It's trying to spare you pain. When it says, "Oh, you could never go for that job. You're not smart enough." It's some people have had abusive caregivers who literally meant them harm. But aside from people with those histories, if your inner critic is saying you could never do that, you're not smart enough, it's really trying to say, don't try, because if you try, you might fail. And if you fail, it'll hurt. And I don't want you to hurt. So it's worth taking the time to explore that. The exercises, a version of it is in the book, just to mention the book here, but it's also in the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook, which is also a wonderful resource. And it's in the course. So what you can do is you look a little closer and you see, oh yeah, now I see that this voice is actually trying to help me, but it's just doing a crappy job. It's doing a hurtful job. It's causing more pain than anything else. And you can't necessarily get rid of it. It isn't able to be surgically removed. So what you have to do is to cultivate a different relationship with it, where you sort of like are able to say, oh, I see what you're trying to do here, but thanks, but no thanks. I actually do want to try for this thing, and I have other resources. I'm willing to risk the possibility of a little pain for something that means something to me. And you can actually slowly replace that critical voice with a self-compassionate voice that wants you to achieve or make change, but for very different reasons, because it wants the best for you, not because it thinks there's something wrong with you. So it was a really long answer, but if you look closely, and that's what self-compassion can help us do, you often see that some of this stuff is not what it says it is, and there's room to work with it in a different way.
So Yvonne has a similar kind of tie-in to that, is that she works with a lot of clients that use or have been used to being punished or bullied as a form of motivation. And that self-compassion, for them, they view it as becoming lackadaisical. So your thoughts or your lens about this approach?
Yeah, that's one of the most common misconceptions about self-compassion, is that somehow it's soft or self-indulgent. If you told someone that you were going to come hear a talk on self-compassion today, somebody may have rolled their eyes, and thought, oh yeah, self-compassion, whatever. Is there going to be a mani-pedi involved? Will there be massage and essential oils or whatever? Not to say anything's wrong with any of those things. But yeah, so when you look a little closer, we're looking closer, you realize that self-compassion does have a warm, comforting side to it. It's like saying to yourself, wow, this is hard. oh, sweetheart, what do you need? Now, I don't call myself sweetheart, but maybe you do. That's okay, whatever the words work. But so there's a tender and a fierce side to self-compassion. Kristen Neff, I'm sure, talked about this in the podcast because this is a favorite topic of hers. The yin side, the comforting, soothing, nurturing side is kind of obvious. But self-compassion has an action side, a fierce side that is about protecting, providing, and motivating ourselves. That is also self-compassion. So protecting ourselves, standing up for something that isn't right and saying no is a self-compassionate act. It's not warm and fuzzy necessarily. It's not self-indulgent, but it is self-compassionate because it's responding to your suffering appropriately. Providing what you need, seeking out what you need is active and not necessarily warm and fuzzy either, but also self-compassionate, because that's that ultimate question of self-compassion is, what do I need? And motivating, like I was saying earlier with the self-critic, we motivate ourselves to make change when we need it, if this is what we need. And that's also self-compassionate and very action oriented. This is what we struggle against. I'm seeing Gail's question about how to talk people into medical settings into MSC. Is probably to not try to do it directly, would be the answer to that. But misgivings about self-compassion are the barriers that you're up against if you're trying to get people to share, to fund or support efforts to teach self-compassion. People are starting to kind of get the mindfulness thing. Self-compassion is a bridge too far for some folks because of how it sounds. So I think really being able to emphasize the strength that it brings, the resiliency that comes from self-compassion. People who are more self-compassionate, like I said, are there are a lot of correlational studies about self-compassion and how it relates to all good things, quality of life, mood, all kinds of things like that. I like to also point, though, to there are only a few studies so far of mindful self-compassion, actually training people to become more self-compassionate. One of them that I think is inspiring, well, first of all, there are a couple of more recent studies of a version of the MSc program called Self-Compassion for Healthcare Communities. It's a shorter version that's been taught to healthcare professionals that's been pretty, showing some early good results for outcomes around mood and quality of life and burnout and things like that. SCHC is the acronym. I think you could probably search for that. But the study that I love the most has more to do with helping people make change, needed change, and it was patients. So a colleague of ours in New Zealand basically taught mindful self-compassion to a group of patients with diabetes. And it was a randomized controlled trial where half of the people had treatment as usual. I'm now questioning whether it was an RCT, but anyway, it was a treatment as usual group that got all the stuff that diabetes patients get, and a group that got mindful self-compassion. And at the conclusion of the study, just the bottom line was that yes, people's mood, quality of life, all the things you would think of had improved for the group that got the mindful self-compassion course, which is great. And that's results of lots of decent interventions. But people's HbA1c levels were significantly improved in the experimental group. So there's nothing magic that happens that you practice self-compassion and your blood glucose decreases or anything like that. What happened is those people took better care of themselves. They actually did what was being asked of them, the hard things, changing diet, changing exercise, doing all the things that are hard to do, that are difficult. But self-compassion actually empowered them to make those changes such that they had improvements, physiological improvements, which I think says a lot about the practice of self-compassion. It's not all just sort of ethereal, warm and fuzzy. There's some real hardcore stuff to it.
And speaking to broaching and bringing in self-compassion training into the healthcare environment, with this new course, I know Kristen has some data out of Austin, I think it is, related to its use in a small cadre of healthcare professionals. But I think knowing what's forthcoming in terms of some big healthcare systems in adopting the Self-Compassion for Healthcare Professionals course, I think we're going to be seeing even more data amongst the healthcare professionals as well. Is there any?
Yeah, we have.
Oh,
Just to add to that, we're just Nietzsche knows this, but the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion just signed a contract with Northern California Kaiser to teach this program there, and they love their data at Kaiser, and so I'm sure we'll have some from that. And speaking to other organizations as well, who've seen enough of those early studies to be intrigued. So,
is there anything in particular that helped to facilitate even just the trials of healthcare systems kind of investing in the Self-Compassion for Healthcare course?
I think the history of that, I don't know a lot of the details, but it was at Dell Children's Hospital in Austin, and frankly, it came the way these things often do. You know, staff feeling burned out, and management trying to figure out what to do about it. So it's not well. It's better than nothing. So anyway, it gets us in the door. But I think the challenge was. Our mindful self-compassion course is 8 weeks long. It's 2 3/4 to 3 hours a session. That's a lot of time. And you've probably noticed that healthcare takes a lot of time as a profession, right? So finding the time, finding a way in. And so our challenge was, how could we replicate as much of the active ingredient of mindful self-compassion in a form that was acceptable in a fast-paced, busy profession and setting. So we had to kind of boil it down to the essence. And I've taught the course a couple of times myself. It's packed with good stuff and challenging, but we've done 6 90-minute sessions. And so it was accessible. They made it accessible. They set aside time in the hospital where people could gather and do this. And we're obviously exploring a lot of things online right now, because so it's about being a little bit creative, I think, about acknowledging that people are super busy, and the fact that people are super busy is actually part of the problem. So there's only so much we can do with that piece. But I think as people, it doesn't take a lot. I mean, I've given you guys a few helpful hints that can start you practicing self-compassion now. So it does take dedication and persistence and regular practice like everything else. But I think that even small things make a difference, and the small things turn into bigger things. It's why, we're having a conversation about self-compassion here in hopes that maybe you'll tinker with it if you haven't already. And if you ask yourselves, what do I need, a time or two in the next day or so, and you're able to respond to it and say, wow, that was, in that moment, that was actually kind of helpful. Maybe you'll take whatever next step, read a little more, practice a little more.
So we'll stay in the kind of different populations realm, and then I'm going to move the lens back into the individual practice of self-compassion. So Miriam did ask a question about if you could speak about bringing mindful self-compassion to children and teens, because we do have a program, right?
Yeah.
Messy.
Yeah. I love that you said we too, Ni-Cheng. So so we have a mindful self-compassion for teens program that is amazingly it's really well received. There's actually more research data on that program than there is on MSC, to be honest. A lot of good things. Our colleague Karen Bluth at UNC Chapel Hill has done some amazing studies with the teen program. It used to be called Making Friends with Yourself, but now it's Mindful Self-Compassion for Teens. And we started offering at UCSD when I was still there, And I was wondering whether teens would take to this. Like, we had a mindfulness course, and that was a bit of a challenge already to kind of get teens to take the mindfulness course. But I actually think our teachers find that teens even take to the self-compassion more because I think mindfulness maybe seems a little esoteric, a little out there. Self-compassion is a little more concrete, and self-criticism is rampant in that age group, as we know from all the statistics around teen suicide and all kinds of acting out and all the challenges and the pressures teens are under. So this is really kind of hitting home for teens in a big way, that they really are. There was actually an article in the New York Times in the last week. I don't think I have a link to it handy, but where these teens were actually commenting on how self-compassion had helped them so much. So it's really heartwarming to hear, because it's a group that needs this a lot. And frankly, a lot of our folks who take MSC say, man, I wish I had these skills when I was a teenager. You know, it would be so much, it would have prevented a lot of heartache over the years. And there are people teaching this to small children as well. That's even more of a challenge. Actually, it's just interesting to see how to bring this practice in a way that people can open their hearts to it, whether it's doctors or kids or teens. Or self-compassion for teens. There we go on the screen. Thanks, Gail. You look up Karen Bluth, Bluth. She has a couple of books on the self-compassion for teens, mindfulness and self-compassion for teens.
And thanks, Gail, for mentioning Dr. Erica Sabinga's having data on mindfulness in teens in inner city exposed to violence. Yeah, so mindfulness has definitely become more entrenched in schools, and we'd like to see kind of similar path of healthcare having adopted mindfulness, but now injecting the self-compassion piece more explicitly into both schools and in healthcare. So I'm going to bring the lens back to the individual. So one of our attendees has found that as she learns more about compassion, and specifically self-compassion, that there's some discouragement about what she sees as a lack of compassion in society and the lack of compassion of others towards her, and it hurts. Do you have any encouragement to continue the practice of self-compassion and mindfulness while accepting the discouragement?
That's a tough one, because I share a lot of that too. I have a hard time tending to things happening in the world because of the lack of compassion. But I do remind myself that there is somewhere in there, there's a silver lining of sorts that I think is worth looking at, which is we often, we see something, we see injustice, just to pick something. We see racial injustice, be very specific. And we just have that sinking feeling like this is so terrible. I feel helpless to do anything about it. I'm discouraged. What's the world coming to? Believe me, I've been there thinking about all of those things. And we kind of, that sends us off on a loop of sadness, depression, frustration, whatever. But what we often forget in that moment is, why does that bother us so much? And it bothers us because underneath that is a value that we hold dearly about justice, about fairness, about kindness, about compassion, whatever it is. Like, we would not be so negatively impacted if we didn't care so much. And it's not an argument for not caring. It's an argument for staying connected to what's important to us, to each of us. So can we, when we are outraged at injustice, we could just get all in the reactivity about that and get frustrated and lash out and yell and scream and write ridiculous Facebook posts and do things that aren't really very fruitful, just upset people and don't get anywhere in a reactive, non-mindful sort of way. Or we can say, wow, this really gets to me because this is so important to me. Let me connect with what that's part of me that holds this so dear. And can I come from that place that maybe acting up and saying something that needs to be said or doing something big, but it comes from a place of being connected to what's important to you, your value, rather than your reaction to the thing. This is making sense. Really kind of like, can we trace back each time we're upset to why does this upset me? What's underneath that? And this is something that I treasure. And if I treasure this, what is it that I can do to further that thing that I treasure rather than try to deal with this sort of downstream effect, if you see what I'm getting at. So it helps to empower us to see, wow, this is so important to me. What is it that's within my grasp to do about this thing? I can't, I see that, patients are becoming more obnoxious towards their doctors. So that is upsetting and everything else. And then all I can do is that if I'm connected to what my value is when someone is unkind to me, rather than getting caught in the reactivity and lashing out or being defensive, can I cultivate a little compassion for this person? Could I see that bad behavior is actually the result of pain in someone else? Can we actually see the pain under the bad behavior, for example? It's not easy, but it connects us more to what is important to us rather than gets us wound up about the sort of, like I said, the downstream effects, if that makes any sense. It's not an easy thing, and it's a bigger topic than I can do in a couple of minutes, but it's worth staying connected to what's important to us so that we can put one foot in front of the other and do the things that we can do that are within our grasp and not be overwhelmed by the task.
And as we're coming to the end of our hour together, Steve, I love acronyms, and you cover a couple of acronyms in your book. Is there a favorite one that you want to share with our attendees and listeners?
Please log in through the Google Home app.
I have two. One is a little racier. It's not the way I wrote it in the book, to be honest, but I'm gonna, hopefully you guys can handle this. But the first one is one that I think actually a physician first told me this. I was doing an assessment with him through the pain clinic, I think, and he talked about OBE being overcome by events. I think it was a military thing where he had picked it up, and I just think that kind of captures where we often are. And if we can, in a moment of overwhelm or difficulty, we can name it, then we can tame it. Not to be too cutesy about it, but so is this a moment of OBE? So that's one. The other one is a little edgier because I think so often when difficult moments arise, like I said, we're not mindful. We don't recognize when we're suffering. So OBE is overcome by events, Angie. So as I said, when we suffer, we don't usually know we're suffering. We don't often say, oh, I'm suffering, or even I'm stressed. We just do stuff. We just push through it, right? But the key to this whole process is being able to acknowledge when something is difficult, when we're having a hard time. Can we just pause long enough to notice it's a hard time? That's the mindfulness part. Otherwise, we're in a reactive autopilot mode and we do a lot of stuff that we don't really want to be doing, and we make bad decisions. But if we can be mindful in the moment, then we have an opportunity to respond in a meaningful way. So often when you're facing a difficult situation, when something's frustrating, when something isn't going right, I like to think of this is an AFGO, another fucking growth opportunity. So you need to have a little lightness with this. It is important. Humor and joy is a part of all of this. And so if you can chuckle at yourself in a moment to say, yeah, this is a moment of suffering, but not so heavy, to say AFGO, it really kind of like breaks a spell, and nothing gets better as a result of it except your attitude. The situation didn't change, but suddenly you've awakened in a moment and can actually respond to it in a different way. And imagine if you're in the middle of something super challenging, you can't get your kid to get into the car seat to get to work, to get to daycare or whatever. Best not to say this out loud, but inside you can say that to yourself. Think about how it shifts how you can take care of yourself in that moment and how you will respond. Think about it. It will shift. Yeah. Oh, I have to give one last. This is in tribute to my mom. This isn't an acronym, and it's equally edgy, but I have to share it with you too. My mother, who passed away a few months ago, taught me this one, which is in a moment of anxiety, breathe in, breathe out, and don't fuck with the sequence. So this is just another kind of like helpful hint. I love particularly that it was my own mom that taught me that one, but it's a helpful, again, this is where mindfulness meets self-compassion. So, you got to have a little lightness, and that's part of what warms up the inner conversation. So that's what I tried to do in the book as well. It's fun to write a For Dummies book because you get to have fun with the topic, which is how I like to teach anyway.
I just want to say, as a pulmonologist, I really appreciate your mom's words of wisdom.
Yes, exactly. I think if you could, you should have it on the wall of the office, but probably not. So you can change it. You can, clean it up a little bit.
And Steve, thank you so much. I was wondering if in the remaining minutes, if you wanted to guide our attendees in an MSC practice or a mindfulness practice.
Yeah, maybe we can just experience, with a slightly slower pace, the SelfCompassion Break that I mentioned earlier. I think it's the most portable pocket practice of self-compassion. So wherever you happen to be, maybe just allowing yourself to drop into this moment inside yourself, maybe peeling your attention off the screen if it's been focused there. Maybe allowing your eyes to close if you'd like. And just taking a moment to notice your breath, the one that has been breathing itself since last you attended to it. And for this exercise, in the future, you can do this when something difficult arises in your life. But for now, calling to mind something that maybe is challenging to you right now in life. Maybe not the biggest thing, but something of a 3 to a 4 on the 1 to 10 scale, some difficult situation. A stress, maybe a relationship issue or a work challenge, and just see if you can kind of bring it to life in your mind. Picture who's involved, the setting, the situation, the feelings and thoughts. Letting it come just a little bit more alive in your awareness just now. And if you notice any even subtle discomfort in the body, any tension or tightness or pounding heart or sinking feeling or whatever is present as you think of this difficult situation, just saying to yourself, this is a moment of suffering. This is mindfulness. Just noticing that what's here is here. As you notice this, recognizing that whatever the experience is, that you share this experience with every other human who ever experienced anything like this. Suffering is actually a part of living. It's a part of being human. So maybe saying that to yourself. Suffering is a part of life. Every human struggles at times. Common humanity. And then finally, just checking in to see, could you be kind to yourself? May I be kind to myself in this moment? What do I need? Maybe it's placing a hand on your heart to feel the warmth of your own touch, the firm, gentle touch of your own hand on yourself. May I be kind to myself? And maybe the kindness is an inner smile or a few words of wisdom or comfort, maybe something you might say to a dear friend who is having a hard time. And as you're ready, letting go of this brief self-compassion break. So that's self-compassion break, the three components: mindfulness, common humanity, self-kindness. Everything wrapped up in one.
Thank you so much, Steve, for your time, for your book, for all that you have done and all that you're doing. And thanks everyone for joining us. I'm also happy to announce, because I am purposefully injecting the Mindful Healthcare Collective with a lot of self-compassion over the winter months, because that tends to be kind of the peak when a lot of healthcare professionals, especially the trainees, are burning out and suffering a lot of moral injury. So I'm really proud to announce and honored that Kristen Neff will be joining us for a book club, the next one, January 27th, on her new book, Fierce Self-Compassion. So I think it ties nicely with your book, and it keeps the motivation for bringing in self-compassion to healthcare professionals as well. So thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you so much, Steve.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Great questions.